Thanks everyone, and to the New Zealand Institute of Architects for giving me this opportunity to speak in Aotearoa. Okay. So, in Australia, we like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we are speaking. And so I'll do that today in New Zealand. I want to acknowledge the mana whenua of this place, the Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, where we're all gathered. Sorry, I've got a bit of a dodgy thing. Here we are. And in the Maori tradition, I will tell you that I'm from the lands of the Wurundjeri, people of the Kulin Nation, from Naarm, which is more commonly known as Melbourne. And most of the projects I'll be showing you tonight are also on the Wurundjeri lands. I'll tell you if they're not. So I'm conscious of the generosity of the New Zealand architects in hosting this lecture, because it invites fellowship with the Australian profession, and it recognises what we have in common, and it celebrates that. And importantly, this dialogue also allows Australian architects to explore the things which are unique to this country, to learn from you, and along the way to share our own uniqueness. This opportunity to speak today comes after an earlier invitation to take part in your National Architecture Awards jury, which I participated in July and August. And I should acknowledge at this point that participation is an enormous privilege for an Australian architect, and it's highly valued by Australian colleagues. I was invited to join this year's jury by convener Cara Robertson, the irrepressible director of innovative, optimistic and talented spacecraft architects. Also invited by Cara were Julie Stout, revered gold medalist, much loved teacher and partner at Mitchell, Stout and Dodd, and Ari Stevens from Athfield Architects, a man well known in the profession for his talent and his intelligence and his sensitivity. The most impactful part of the national jury is the nearly 2 weeks that the jury spends together visiting shortlisted projects across the country. Obviously involving a lot of travel, this time together naturally also means in-depth conversations about architecture, its place in society and culture, and all of the very many intersecting aspects of life which inform and shape our experience of it. So I'd also like to extend special thanks to Katie Tomlinson and Joe Bates from your institute, and also to Nick and Courtney here tonight, who facilitated this complex and exhausting itinerary so well. But I want to come back to these back-of-the-bus conversations because they were the genesis of this talk. How to be an architect now. The reason I ask this question is that I think that what is required of us is unique to the moment in time, this moment in time. But the answer to this question tells a positive story, because I think as a profession, and despite it frequently being to our own detriment, being an architect now means trying to make a positive impact much more broadly than just the production of buildings. It's always wonderful for an architect to experience their colleagues' work, especially at the high level encountered on a national jury. But what struck me, especially on this year's jury, came not just from the buildings, but from the conversations with the architects. On every project, there was always so much more than a building. There was passion, inquiry, engagement, and a sense of responsibility from the architects. And from the clients, there was a genuine appreciation and gratitude for partnership, listening, and the impulse to be relevant, positive, useful, and helpful, and to contribute. In Australia, in the states of Victoria and New South Wales, moves are afoot to abolish the Architects Act, acts of Parliament which define and regulate what we do as a profession. The abolishment argument goes that we don't need an Act of Parliament for architects because being an architect is just a job, essentially a transactional activity with no higher purpose than just to provide services for money. In an article by an Australian critic, Elizabeth Farrelly, which I would all encourage you to read, she asks, the duty of care implied by professionalism and protected with the title architect under the Act is not just about structural integrity and damp-proof bathrooms. It also includes cleaner air, better streets and more livable neighbourhoods. If our protection of the public good is not evident to the public, perhaps we should ask ourselves why not? Is it they who don't understand us or we who don't understand them? And I think Elizabeth Farrelly raises a good point, but off the back of the incredible experience in Aotearoa, listening to you and your colleagues talking about such an impressive array of excellent buildings, I actually started to feel a renewed optimism about our profession. I think as architects that we are thinking about cleaner air, better streets and more livable neighbourhoods. But I also think we're thinking about housing security, climate breakdown and reconciliation with our respective Indigenous cultures. And as if that wasn't enough, I think that as a profession, we're interested in contributing to a vibrant culture through making, interpreting and representing. As a profession, we're interested in art, music, fashion, sport and food. And we form an important part of the taste-making and connoisseurship that drives culture and identity and makes the world a good place to live in. So I want to talk about just some of the things that demonstrate what we are all doing to be an architect now. And I'll do it with some of my own projects in my practice, not because I think we're doing it better or differently than anyone else, but merely as examples. Something I see everywhere in architecture and which I think we should all be celebrating. I'm going to talk about some of the areas where architects are doing more than transacting services for payment, areas where our professionalism means contributing to the public, where the benefits of our job are balanced with our responsibility to society. These contributions are manifold, but I will just talk about a couple. Many of you will be familiar with the Nightingale model, and of course Claire Cousins spoke about it at this very lecture last year. However, I do want to revisit it briefly because it's a great example of how our profession contributes beyond the mere provision of architectural services. What's special about the Nightingale model is that, led by Breed's Jeremy McLeod, architects recognised a problem with developer-driven multi-res housing. It was wasteful, unsustainable, energy-efficient buildings. The design decisions were led by real estate agents and marketing people. There was no sense of community. There was a short tenure. It was an average of 11 months in Melbourne. People would stay in an apartment. They were pretty poor value for money, and there was a distinct lack of housing types, options. Also, they completely excluded social housing or community housing. They were all for sale and for profit. So, Nightingale was born from an idea by architect Jeremy McLeod and enthusiastically joined and embraced by other architects who saw that the only way to address these issues was to take on the developer's role, including the developer's financial risk, but significantly, we didn't take on the developer's profit. So this is our Nightingale, which we called Left Field. It is part of the Nightingale Village, which includes 5 other Nightingale buildings, with Claire Cousins' Evergreen shown on the left here. Like all the others, it includes external circulation, which conserves energy, it's healthier and encourages incidental interaction in the communities. It has a communal roof garden, which includes a landscape design by our regular collaborator Amanda Oliver, who does all of our single residential gardens. It has a communal laundry, which frees up space in the apartments, making them cheaper, but also helping build community through shared spaces and resources. There's minimal car parking, there's car share on site, and extensive bike parking, and that also reduces the cost of the dwellings. And it takes advantage of the available public transport because they're frequently located on land which developers wouldn't want to touch on railway lines. Interiors which bring the best of our single residential practices, mine and some of the other people involved, to a typology which was previously dominated by white plasterboard and downlights. In all of the Nightingales, you will find an emphasis on amenity over the marketing bling. Indeed, a significant positive impact of Nightingale is that it has brought practices like ours, previously best known for single residential, into accessible multi-residential market, and proved that there is an appetite for colour and texture and playfulness. And I suppose most critically, Nightingale has also set new benchmarks in sustainability for this building typology. Nightingale has also put pressure on authorities to require more inclusion. Our Nightingale has 20% blind tenure for social housing and includes all ages and diverse household profiles. And despite all the fears of this, it is a highly functioning community. Inclusionary zoning, which means including social housing components, is now on the agenda with governments in Australia, and I think the Nightingale housing model has very definitely contributed to this shift. So I guess the moral of this story is not that architects should become developers. Few of us want to do that, nor am I suggesting that Nightingale is the answer or that it is perfect. Its significance is that it has moved the dial when the dial stubbornly was not moving. And this is why I'm using Nightingale as my first example of what architects do, which is more than services for fees, because it's an example where architects are using our skills and our training for the public benefit and a commitment to help. The best part of it is that by leading by example, when we were not able to influence our clients in our traditional role as architects, Nightingale has completely changed developer-led projects and raised consumer expectations. Now the real estate and marketing people are telling us to activate the ground planes and provide communal spaces and embed sustainability and make warm domestic spaces like it was their idea in the first place. But this is a good outcome because there is a measurable concrete shift. Apartment buildings which are now more sustainable, more domestic, more community focused and more diverse in their dwelling types on offer. So our work with Nightingale has led to other projects where practices like ours, who have traditionally been pigeonholed as only capable of single high-end residential, can now bring fresh approaches to domestic spaces and interiors, sensitively designed communal areas. We can challenge accepted notions of urban design and bring new interpretations to heritage contexts through abstraction and detail, and bring architectural thinking to public housing and giving dignity to residents and contributing to the city. In Australia, most often when anything happens in a public setting, it is considered appropriate or necessary to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country, as I did at the start of this talk. Recently at a talk in Melbourne, Gerard Reinmuth of Australian Practice Terroir was reflecting on the acknowledgement of country as he told us that in Denmark, where his office also has an office, it is customary for architects to, when speaking publicly about their buildings, to acknowledge the carbon of that building, to state the carbon footprint of any building they're going to discuss publicly. And I raise this because I think the acknowledgement of country that we do in Australia and that you do here, I think it's a really important way of architects being more publicly spirited beyond just transacting for fees. And then this example in Denmark is yet another example of how architects are trying to address this problem, this climate emergency that we're having. So that's something that architects are doing. And you'll all know about Architects Declare movement, and I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have joined this declaration. So this is a really authentic movement, and it reflects genuine concern in our profession, if not panic, about the state of the climate. But importantly, it is also a commitment to address it. Joining movements like Architects Declare, as well as public demonstrations and buying carbon credits on flights and being careful with recycling are important, but only if they're backed up with real action. And the 10 aims of Architects Declare are a concrete guide, which many of us have signed up to, and these are serious commitments. Architects Declare is one example among many of our commitment as a profession to the public good outside of a transactional work for services model. Whilst on the national jury, I saw evidence of this commitment everywhere in New Zealand. And what struck me was the way architects were leading clients, even when those clients were already committed to sustainability outcomes. One of the most important ways we can affect change, and one that is specifically referenced in Architects Declare, is through collaboration. And there's a theme here. Working solo, as we often do, it feels hard to make an impact. But working together, things start to happen. And I would say that is the truth for Kennedy Nolan. We are not leaders in any of these areas, but we're very eager or enthusiastic followers. And I think that's what we can all do. So I kept seeing collaboration in action while on the national jury in New Zealand, in projects of all types and scales. And today I'm going to illustrate an example of my own experience of collaboration through a little project we did in Melbourne, which addresses point 6 of the Architects Declare, which is about reuse of existing buildings. So I'm just going to... We regularly collaborate with Ross Harding of Finding Infinity. He's a sort of Svengali guru of sustainability, and today I want to show you a sustainable retrofit project, which was a collaboration facilitated by Ross. You can see him here pictured in the blue Adidas tracksuit, which he has in every colour, including a black one, which he adds a black tie to for black tie functions. And this is the team that came together for this project. It consists of Ross and his colleague Will from Finding Infinity, They're the sustainability consultants, but also the progenitors of this project and the people who have documented and promoted its findings. The money, which is such an important part of this project, came from Triple, which is a family company focused on ethical investment, and this is Jake Milgram from Triple. And it was built by Wilderness Building Company, and so these are builders with a heartfelt commitment to sustainable construction practices. They're responsible for the use of materials, and they manage and minimise construction waste and packaging. So Kaya, who leads Wilderness, is on the right, with his colleagues Pat on the left and Rika in the middle. Emma, from Resin Project Management, so project managers were also involved in this, was a professional with aligned values. And I think this is another thing, is actually there are a lot of people out there who want to contribute in all areas. And part of our role as architects, because we're always the consultant in the middle, is bringing them all together. But they do exist even in the evil project management world. And as Kennedy Nolan as architects were superlatively represented here by my business partner, Rachel Nolan. The project was part of a wider idea called a new normal, a commitment by a group of Australian architects, originally in Melbourne, but now in Sydney and in Perth, facilitated by Ross and Finding Infinity, to make cities carbon positive by 2030. A new normal started with aspirations and ideas, but it is now informing real projects, and I would encourage you all to look it up. A new normal is another collaboration, led by Ross, but including a collection of prominent Melbourne architects and allies in engineering, construction and media. Once again, a new normal is not something we led, but it was a vehicle for us to contribute. And much like with Nightingale, it takes leaders, exceptional, dogged, sometimes little fanatical people, to dream up these schemes. But the way they can have an impact is when egos get put aside and people can join in and affect change. And I think that's another thing. The leaders, that is such a key and important role, but actually the delivery side that most of us do all the time is so important, because the ideas don't happen unless, all of us workhorses get in behind it and actually make it. So to our new normal project, which addresses point 6 of the Architects Declare. And this is the building we were retrofitting and as we found it. Our aim was to do the least possible to make the most impact. So this is not a glamorous architectural project. And this is Finding Infinity's program of the environmental aspirations. In the words of Ross, they are a grand total of a whole lot of boring bits, but they're very important bits. A lot of the environmental bits help create a lovely home, because the insulation, airtightness and new windows keep the apartments warm and quiet, and increased performance keeps the bills low. And this is it complete, not specially different, but it's significantly different in operation. It was renamed William Narang, and by and with permission of the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri, and means place to reflect. It is Australia's first plus energy retrofit of an apartment block. It is a modest project, but the principal aim of it is to serve as a prototype. As I said, it doesn't look so different, but this is what we did. Doors and windows were replaced with recycled plastic double glazed units and combined with an airtight lime-based paint. Airtightness was massively improved. We got everything on Finding Infinity's initial diagram, bar the external blinds, with no thanks to the fire engineer. So this felt pretty good. We didn't manage to get additional storage for our tenants, which is a problem, and we didn't manage to solve the disability access. But in general, I think it was a big plus. So doing the least possible meant a brutally pragmatic approach. But despite this, we were able to achieve an 80% reduction in bills, an 80% reduction in embodied carbon emissions compared to constructing an equivalent new building, a 35% reduction in mains water, improved comfort, and we appointed Homeground, an ethical real estate business where 100% of profits go to helping end homelessness, and where 2 of the apartments are rented out below market to support those needing help to enter the rental market. Also, on this building, there is a commitment to paying the rent to traditional owners. So once again, I would encourage you to find out more about William Narang. Here's the website. There's quite a bit to it, and the monitoring of it is ongoing. And look, I see examples of this kind of endeavour everywhere in architecture, and I saw it all over New Zealand when I was here earlier this year, and it inspired the theme of this talk. change, innovation, a commitment to addressing the greatest challenges humans currently face through advocacy, thought, passion, technical innovation, and frequently a good portion of sweat equity. Reflecting on our role as architects, I think that it is really the role of synthesis, understanding everyone else's role, corralling their contributions and making it all into one thing, and that one thing which should also be delightful, comfortable, and sometimes beautiful. An important part of our role at William Narang was literally to try and turn a sow's ear into a silk's purse, and to do this with the fewest possible resources. Architects are frequently accused of being shallow or venal because we are preoccupied by how things look. But the team at William Narang recognised the social importance of human occupation, our need to connect to our environments, to live in spaces which are dignified by utility and beauty. And this is not superficial work. This is work which contributes to well-being, and at its best and its most inspiring helps form our society and our culture. And of course, sustainable retrofit is just one of the countless ways that architects are addressing the climate catastrophe, from the small prototypical scale of William Narang up to very large projects by our colleagues in Australia and by people in this room. And the important point is that you, your colleagues, all of us are doing this work, and that by recognising that and by celebrating it, I think we're encouraged to do more. Off the back of William Narang, we're currently working on more projects under the banner of New Normal, including a sustainable retrofit of Graham Gunn's State Heritage listed Plumbers and Gasfitters Union building, which we were working on with Graham, sharp and full of ideas and passion right up until his recent death last month at the age of 91. This is another interesting thing about architects, I think, is that they will work till they drop. And so Graham is a person who, he was literally on life support and he still was holding a pen. I think that's a remarkable testament to our profession. This project is also a prototype. It's an example of how to retrofit important heritage buildings and office buildings. The Plumbers Union, which is allied to the powerful Construction Union, is vitally interested in protecting the workstream of its members against constraining limits of ballooning construction costs, and also in how they're also interested in how electrification affects his gas fitting trades. So a big part of their membership is involved with gas. And so these projects necessarily incorporated some difficult conversations. Construction starts soon, and a protected building, like in terms of heritage, it's got the highest heritage rating you can have in Australia, which is on the verge of being abandoned, will now be fully accessible, have massively improved thermal comfort. It has significantly reduced operational costs and will include infrastructure to explore biogas and hydrogen as future decarbonised fuels, and providing a pathway to the job security for plumbers and gas fitters. It doesn't have natural gas now, though. The project started with Ross telling us, let's get the plumbers and gas fitters off gas, and we actually have managed to do that. Another New Normal collaboration with Finding Infinity is this multifunction public building in Brunswick, Melbourne, which currently includes an Indigenous art gallery, creative spaces for hire, maternal health services and a park. And this complex project targets energy use, water use, energy production, circular materiality, retrofit of existing buildings on the site, and repair of country. It's approaching completion, and we have just embarked on the early stages of a new Normal project with Finding Infinity, a 32-storey mass timber tower with a solar facade in Adelaide. So New Normal is starting to have an impact on lots of buildings in Australia now. That's another collaboration based on shared values and an example of putting Architects Declare into action, another example of a project that we couldn't do without leaders and collaborators. So I think it's important to remember that when people are critical of architects for doing things like acknowledging country or insisting on carbon offsets on flights, and they think it's virtue signalling, and I think it's shallow and that it doesn't do anything. I think those things are really important. They're all examples of the seriousness with which we take these issues, and they are backed up with real things that we're all doing. So another issue that both your country and ours is having to grapple with is reconciliation with our First Nations people, and what our part is to be part of this solution. The buildings that we saw in this year's jury were born in the Ardern years, and I observed something really remarkable which came out of that. As I understand it, the Ardern government made a serious attempt to progress Maori equality through, amongst other things, the establishment of Te Arabiti, recognition of language and culture, financial redress and apologies. But more broadly, by making New Zealand a place where recognition of Maori culture and language and acknowledgement of past injustices could be discussed, understood and expressed. So what struck me was the enthusiasm and passion with which New Zealand's architects picked this up. Everywhere we went, we heard stories, sometimes very harrowing stories, and we saw serious attempts to grapple with the impacts of colonisation, but also to recognise and celebrate Maori culture, society, language and art. And this was done through an open-hearted, open-minded engagement with mana whenua and iwi. Can you just scroll my text up a little bit, please? Significantly, I also saw our Māori architects both contributing to and leading projects, bringing authentic perspectives and knowledge to them. In Australia, we look to you to learn how to reconcile with our own beautiful Indigenous culture. And I feel really proud that our profession to note that this, as in Aotearoa, Australian architects have grasped the importance of it. We all want to learn from traditional owners. We're insisting on acknowledgement and change, and we're following the advice of our First Nations leaders. The process of reconciling with First Nations people has only just begun for Australians and was massively set back by our referendum on the voice to Parliament last year. And so as a profession, we are grappling with how to be an architect respectfully, responsibly and consciously on land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land. How do we address stolen land, stolen birthrights, dispossession, dislocation, lost traditions, lost languages, injustice, criminal acts against Indigenous Australians, including genocide in Tasmania, racism? What we are learning in Australia is to know the importance of country. This is helping us with this process. And this is why we have learned to acknowledge country that we're on and to recognise the traditional owners. Understanding country is vital, and it's our way to reconcile through caring for country. If we care for country, we are acknowledging the ineffable and unbreakable link between First Nations people and that land. So buildings don't need to be the centre of this, and obviously not all buildings serve Aboriginal people. Most are materially, economically and culturally unconnected. However, they all exist on Aboriginal land, and this is a way for us to honour this is to care for that land. Colonisation has transformed the landscape in Australia. The concept of land as a spiritual part of self, one inseparable from the other, is diametrically opposed to the colonisers' perception of land as a resource. But reconciliation requires us to reconcile these two ways of thinking. Actually, what we're slowly learning is that an Indigenous approach to land is really what we most need now. Increasingly, we can see that traditional land management, knowledge and techniques can repair land and waterways, restore fertility, manage bushfires, be drought resistant and mitigate floods. Removing feral animals and restoring soil and native fauna improves all land, including cropping and grazing land. And Indigenous food sources can provide greater nutrition with less water and no fertilisers. So, architects are now increasingly interested in this repair. Construction is inherently additive, even destructive, but the process can involve repair of land. This project of ours is on Boonwurrung land. It was previously cleared for grazing in the early 20th century, which obliterated the coastal ecosystem. Nothing remained, and then subsequently it was subdivided and invaded by exotic weeds. But repair can take place even on a small scale. And I think this is a good lesson for us, is that everything we do can be reparative. Through weed removal, through respecting terrain, and through re-establishment of Indigenous plantings. The house is called Always, acknowledging that the land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. These projects are minuscule increments on the path to reconciliation. The significance is that in every decision about design, that decision will be improved if it understands and respects the country it's on. And there is a wider imperative to care for country, because it goes hand in glove with addressing the climate catastrophe. You know, it's really interesting to note that for 60,000 years, Indigenous Australians lived in perfect balance with the land, caring for it so it could care for them. In 200 years, we've just about wrecked the joint. When I was here on the jury, I heard similar stories about Maori careful management of resources, of a symbiosis with the land, which was inherently sustainable. And I think we all need a bit of that. So not everything architects do is as serious as some of the things I've been talking about. And I want to talk about another important role that architects do which benefits society, and that is our role as tastemakers, as connoisseurs, as interpreters of the zeitgeist, our role in contributing to culture. In our practice, shown here, much of our work has been in residential architecture, where it can feel like the scope to address these big issues is limited. So I think it's important to emphasise that this is important work too, because it involves deep thinking about humans and how we live. And the work we all do ultimately influences the way all buildings are made. So I'm going to show you some of our residential projects to illustrate what we're all doing all the time, by being curious, interested, and creative, and sometimes in very small ways. I'll start off with the work we do in heritage. So New Zealand has a similar stock of post-settlement heritage buildings to Australia. So these are highly valued both for their historic and aesthetic importance. And part of our role of an architect is to design in, around and near to build heritage and interpret it to manage newness so that it's comfortable and tell a new story. This is a very complex and difficult thing which we do. We take old materials and we compose them into unfamiliar arrangements to perform new uses. We inform ourselves about vernaculars and represent them to amplify and expand on that architectural language. We use abstraction and adapt heritage imagery to contemporary uses to make buildings which speak to past traditions and distill their essence. We also deal with context in everything we're doing. With every context, we take a first principles approach to make specific buildings which consider aspect, prospect and refuge specific to their context and the aesthetic and qualitative characteristics of the surrounding neighbourhood. We think about buildings at all times of the day and night and how they can be quietly generous to the street. We take pains to understand the formal and aesthetic qualities of cities, and then we dream up new forms and aesthetics which are eccentric or idiosyncratic, but visually and aesthetically connected to the surrounding urbanism. And we make sure those places are livable. An architect challenges housing typologies to adapt to contemporary values, de-emphasising entry, placing it discreetly, and privileging privacy to the street, and privileging the living areas with scale and aspect and connection. And in a coastal context, we think about the form as a lightly perched creature, enigmatic and ultimately receding as the landscape reclaims the site. A form which conceals domestic comfort and interior richness. Another thing that we do as architects is make visual language. Architects are fascinated with buildings and the history of architecture. They read about it, they travel obsessively to look at it. It's a lifelong pursuit. And then, when a brief requires a swimming pool on a small site, we take this accumulated knowledge and experience and we make something new, which is also deeply connected to that knowledge, but somehow familiar. And using our knowledge and our passion for building crafts and techniques, we collaborate with builders to realise it. And we're adaptable, so that when a client returns from Mexico obsessed with Louis Barragan, we can adapt this reference to Western Port Bay and celebrate the inspiration, abstracting and modulating it through a design process which has to do 1,000 other things. We deploy elements of architecture when they are necessary and beautiful. A brise-soleil to manage privacy and solar gain, but also to unify a facade and give it clarity and strength. And we take this cue to generate a design sensibility which encompasses every element. Each element of a building is an opportunity for expressiveness through change of scale or abstraction. In this case, an eave, which sets up a visual language for everything else. Or in this house, where the chimney is simplified and abstracted amongst a series of complementary forms, it tells a simple story of the hearth, which is a domestic space to gather. All buildings have to do so much provide shelter, accommodate specific and diverse uses, perform thermally, meet the planning code and the building code, manage privacy, acoustics, provide aspect, light and ventilation to the interior. They must be durable, manage a budget, and they need to be respectful of their neighbourhood. They must manage terrain and climate and infrastructure, and they've got to be conscious of the carbon footprint and energy and water use, and should consider how they are recycled. And on top of this, they should be beautiful. So synthesising all of this is the job of an architect, and it is our unique skill. It's our unique skill as a profession that, considering some or ideally all of these things, we can make a singular object which also tells a story about who uses it, or where it is, or when it was made. A good building is more than the sum of its parts, but what is exciting about our profession is that those parts are always different, and thus so are the buildings. I also want to talk a bit about landscape because it's such an important part of what we do. Good architecture is buildings in a balanced relationship to landscape. Balance is the important word because it implies a project-specific but critical relationship in every instance. And this is a relationship over time. I spoke earlier about the opportunities to repair country, to reintroduce Indigenous plants and provide habitats for insects and animals, to restore soils and to manage water runoff, which improves as it grows. Planted roofs have great thermal qualities and embed buildings in the landscape. But they're expensive, and there are lots of other opportunities to make places for plants. It's good for cities, reducing heat island effects, creating habitats essential for a highly functioning ecosystem, but also acknowledging the fundamental human need for a connection to the natural world. Gardens are valued elements of domestic space, but when considered in conjunction with built form, they are also working hard, making buildings legible, identifying entry points, elevating thresholds, screening for privacy, shading for comfort. And because they change with seasons and flower and produce scent and drop their leaves and attract birds and insects and move in the wind and most wondrously grow, they make the static dynamic and joyous, and they are irresistible to humans. In our practice, we feel like the landscape, the gardens, which are mostly done with our important collaborator Amanda Oliver, are integral to both the beauty and the function that we are attempting to achieve. The balance shifting into a better place over time. It's impossible for us to imagine these houses without their gardens. And not just because they're beautiful, they are all working hard in the ways I've described. They are living elements of the architecture. And then the last element I want to discuss is the interior. Just as we see an essential balance between buildings and landscape, we also value a balanced relationship between a building and its interior. We are essentially, in our practice, 20th century in our belief that architecture starts at the edge of the site, sometimes maybe even suggesting a relationship beyond the site. And it includes the terrain and the landscape, and it goes into the building, and it includes the spatial and material experience of interiority with as much intensity as the external form. When we design a building, we are thinking of all the parts, the colours, the materials, the textures, and the way these elements interact with light, both natural and artificial. And this goes for both inside and outside. We are interested in the way interiors sound and even the way they smell. We think that memory, both individual and collective, is often generated by a sensory experience of interior, and believe that this is intensified by consideration of interior elements. Colours, textures, shadows and patterns are common materials, common memories for people, as are the smell of certain rooms or the modulation of space, going from a confined space to a larger space, for example. We are always aspiring towards a certain theatricality. Sometimes this is flamboyant or arresting, but it can also be peaceful and reflective. Theatre makes you feel things, but it can be any number of things. And so I'm going to finish on our most recently completed project, which opened last week. It's a hotel in Melbourne. I'll need some help with the scrolling on this one too. So it's a hotel in Melbourne CBD, and the largest and most complex project our practice has ever undertaken. And I want to show you this building because it is an example of synthesis. All professions are required to synthesise multiple things in their work, but I think that the practice of architecture is exceptional in the scope of synthesis required. It is interesting to note that the historical periods can be described by architectural expression. Think of Georgian, Victorian, Edwardian, or of Renaissance, Baroque, Neoclassical, Modernist, Postmodernist, all eras which can be understood visually by the architecture. Similarly, cultures can be understood architecturally. French, Pacifica, Japanese. We can picture an architecture to represent these cultures. New Zealand and Australia have distinct architectural expressions too. It's a symbiotic relationship, I think, the architecture both reflecting and influencing the time. This is an important role and we are all doing it. And I think that the reason for this symbiotic relationship is that architecture is at its best is synthesis, doing lots of things at once to make an effortless, singular thing. A pithy, detailed, distilled, uncanny image of many things. This is true of the buildings we make, but also of how we deliver them. We are mostly the only ones involved who know what everyone else is up to. Clients, stakeholders, authorities, engineers, every one of a multitude of consultants, builders, subcontractors, and building users. We're involved with all of these parties. We are looking around at other buildings, of course, but also at art, at landscapes, and fashion, and films, and lots more, and synthesising that into something. So it's a pretty special role. This building is special for us because it's our first foray into city making. We designed the building and almost all of the interiors. And we collaborated with Amanda Oliver on the garden elements, and we collaborated with a score of other people, including the brickmakers in Western Victoria who specifically made the bricks for this project. We collaborated with the builder and the trades on every element of the building. We commissioned furniture and lighting from local makers, some of whom we worked with for many years. The architectural ideas that generated the building are evident everywhere in the interiors. Intense exploration of colour, which you can see through the building. A domestic experience, which is one of the things we were really keen to imbue in this hotel, that it had some of the qualities that our single residential projects would have. The idea that you could go to a hotel and not feel you were part of a global experience, that you were experiencing something very specific and domestic in Melbourne. So this has just been photographed 2 weeks ago, so it's very new. A lot of this is new for me to look at as well. It's also a very earnest attempt at an Australian aesthetic. We're really keen to think, what does an Australian hotel look like? What does a hotel in Melbourne look like? And we spent a lot of time developing what we thought that might be. So I need some scrolling up with this too. So to round out this discussion, I want to revisit the original idea for it, how to be an architect today. Being an architect today is not easy, and it's different to any other time in history. So it's very easy to feel defeated or despondent about what we face every day. Difficult clients, regulation, always more and more, risk allocation, again, always more, cost pressures which sometimes feel insurmountable, authorities and stakeholders with small imaginations and who are sometimes confusingly openly hostile. We have to consider so much: the climate emergency, living on colonised land, population growth and housing security. And we are so aware of what everyone else is doing because we are overwhelmingly linked up via the internet. We're trying to make a living. It's hard as a business owner, if not harder as an employee. And the world is in turmoil with a lunatic in charge of the White House. But I felt inspired by my jury tour here this year because what I saw was architects and their clients and other collaborators passionately grappling with all of these things, working together, committed to solutions, optimistic about outcomes, wanting things to improve and working hard to achieve that. And it made me proud to be an architect, and it made me want to reflect on everything we do and to defend our profession. Rachel, my business partner, and I always say to us, Rachel and I, we always say to our staff, be in the world, travel, read, have fun, because the best architecture reflects life and culture, not just other architecture. which is of course the limitation of AI. It is just referencing other buildings, but what makes architecture interesting and human is when it invents new ways of living, addresses external forces like climate change, engages with politics and social justice, reflects culture, and expresses dreaming, inventing and making. In the past, architecture was mostly used to project power. If you think of the pyramids of Versailles or Gothic Cathedral, and it still does, of course, but our profession has evolved into one populated with passionate people committed to understanding and interpreting and helping. When discussing this talk with Rachel, she focused on the idea of helping, the way architects so often want to help, and I think that's a nice way to think about what we do. The hard slog of our work continues next week, but right now we are celebrating excellence at the awards this evening, an event held every year in recognition that excellence is ongoing, that it happens every year, right across the profession. So congratulations to the shortlisted architects and the winners, of course, but congratulations to all of you for the work you all do every day.